He was fired at 8:17 a.m., still out of breath, shoes splashed with rainwater, hands trembling from the memory of a terrified pregnant woman gripping his arm on the side of a lonely highway. By 8:30, security was escorting him out of the building he had given 5 loyal years to. And by 9:00, Daniel Reed, single father of a 7-year-old girl, was sitting in his car, staring at the steering wheel, wondering how one act of kindness had just cost him everything. If you believe kindness should never be punished, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness. Stories like this remind us that compassion still matters. That morning had begun like every other, quiet, rushed, fragile. Daniel had woken before dawn to pack his daughter Lily's lunch, braid her messy brown hair the way she liked, and leave a sticky note in her backpack with a tiny heart drawn at the bottom. Since his wife had passed away 3 years earlier, Daniel had lived in a constant balancing act between grief and responsibility. He worked as a mid-level operations assistant at a large logistics company, barely earning enough to cover rent, school fees, and the medical bills that still lingered like ghosts in his mailbox. He could not afford to be late. His supervisor had warned him twice already that punctuality was non-negotiable. The company had recently appointed a new CEO, a woman known only through internal emails and polished corporate memos. No one had seen her much. Rumors described her as brilliant, strict, and intolerant of excuses. Daniel was 10 minutes away from the office when he saw the car pulled over ahead. A silver sedan sat awkwardly on the roadside, hazard lights blinking weakly in the gray morning fog. He might have driven past like everyone else. He almost did. But then he saw her. A pregnant woman in a long pink dress leaned against the back of the car, one hand pressing against her lower back, the other gripping the trunk for support. Her face was pale, strained, and her hair clung damply to her cheeks. A red arrow sign stuck to the rear window, likely from some earlier roadside assistance, fluttered loosely, pointing nowhere in particular. But her eyes were filled with unmistakable urgency. Daniel's foot moved to the brake before his mind could argue. When he stepped out, the cool air carried the sound of her uneven breathing. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was in pain. Her contractions had started earlier than expected. Her phone battery had died. Her driver had left to get help and hadn't returned. Cars passed, indifferent blurs of metal and motion. Daniel didn't hesitate. He helped her into his own car carefully, speaking softly, trying to keep her calm as he drove toward the nearest hospital. Every red light felt like an enemy. Every minute ticking on the dashboard clock echoed like a warning bell for his job. Yet he didn't turn back. At the hospital entrance, nurses rushed her inside. She grasped his sleeve for a brief second before disappearing behind double doors. Daniel never even asked her name. He simply nodded, relieved she was safe, and ran back to his car. By the time he reached work, soaked in stress and 15 minutes late, the damage was done. His supervisor didn't want explanations. Company policy was clear. Attendance issues reflected a lack of commitment. Daniel tried to speak, to explain about the stranded pregnant woman, but the words felt small against the cold walls of corporate indifference. He was handed a termination letter and told to clear his desk. Walking out with a cardboard box under his arm, Daniel felt smaller than he ever had. It wasn't just about pride. It was about Lily. Rent was due in 2 weeks. He had no savings left. Kindness, it seemed, did not pay bills. That evening, he didn't tell Lily the truth. He smiled through dinner, helped her with homework, and lay awake long after she had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, calculating numbers that refused to add up. 3 days later, his phone rang from an unknown number. He almost ignored it. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, yet strangely familiar. He was asked to come to the company headquarters the next morning for a meeting with the CEO. Daniel assumed it was about final paperwork or perhaps a severance correction. He ironed his only formal shirt that night with quiet dignity. When he stepped into the executive floor lobby, the air felt different, quieter, heavier with importance. The assistant led him into a spacious office lined with glass walls overlooking the city. And then he saw her. The same woman from the highway stood near the window, no longer in distress but radiating authority. Her pink dress was replaced by a tailored suit, yet there was no mistaking her face. Her hand now rested gently on a newborn cradled in her arms. She was the CEO. The silence stretched between them, thick with realization. Daniel felt heat rush to his face. He wondered if this was some elaborate misunderstanding. But then she smiled, a soft, grateful smile that erased the cold image he had imagined from corporate emails. She had learned his name from hospital staff and had asked her team to investigate. When she discovered he had been fired for arriving late that morning, she requested a full report. What she found disturbed her deeply. Policies had been enforced without humanity. Leadership had forgotten compassion. Daniel had expected closure. Instead, he was offered something unimaginable. His job was reinstated immediately, with back pay. But that wasn't all. She announced a new company-wide initiative prioritizing employee well-being, flexible emergency policies, and a support fund for single parents. She asked Daniel to help lead the program, believing that someone who understood struggle could guide meaningful change. Daniel stood there overwhelmed, not just by relief, but by validation. His act of kindness, once punished, had sparked transformation at the highest level of the company. The CEO later admitted that during those painful minutes on the roadside, she had felt invisible, powerful in title, yet helpless in reality. It was a stranger, an ordinary single father, who reminded her what true leadership looked like. Daniel returned home that evening with tears in his eyes, not of despair this time, but of gratitude. When he hugged Lily tighter than usual, she giggled and asked why he was squeezing so hard. He simply whispered that sometimes, doing the right thing brings blessings you never expect. The story spread quietly within the company, then beyond. Employees began sharing moments where they chose compassion over convenience. The workplace slowly transformed from rigid to human. And Daniel, he never regretted stopping that morning, because sometimes the short